In this presentation, I look at the potential impact of changes made to the 2015 version of ISO 9001. However, I can only generalize, as the changes will impact each organization differently, depending on the approach each have taken to managing the quality of their outputs. First of all, I will compare some basic characteristics of the 1994, 2008 and 2015 versions, and then look at the requirements that have been withdrawn. I will discuss some changes in terminology, and then a few of the new requirements and those that have been modified. I will end by summarizing the direction I believe ISO 9001 is changing. When we compare the 1994, 2008 and 2015 versions of the standard, we can see how much it has changed over the last 20 years. You may recall the 1994 version was based on a 20-element structure, but in 2000 this was changed to 5 major sections, and this structure has been maintained for the 2008 revision. With the introduction of a harmonized structure for all management system standards, commonly referred to as Annex SL, which is an annex of ISO directives governing the procedures for the development of international standards, the structure changed from 5 to 7 sections. Oddly enough, the number of clauses remain the same, and the number of shall statements has not changed dramatically. But everywhere there is an and or a comma or a list, there are additional requirements, and therefore we see a significant change in the number of requirements in the new version. The number of documented procedures required has changed significantly over the years, from 26 in the 1994 version to 0 in the 2015 version. But don't be fooled by this change. It is indicative of the trend to reduce the documentation requirements so as to make the standard more flexible and suitable for a wide range of sectors. The requirements for individual records is reduced a little, and those for specific documents changed a little too. As we can see in this comparison, in place of the quality manual, the scope statement remains. Documented responsibility and authority is no longer required, and neither are documented criteria for special processes, and the requirement for documented control of outsourced processes has gone. But oddly enough, the basis for calibration has to be documented. When we attempt to map the location of the requirements in the 2008 version onto the 2015 version, we can see that they have been dispersed, and finding their new location requires some detective work. Some of the requirements for the new sections have been drawn from several sections of the 2008 version. But in fact, only the section on improvement in the new version draws its requirements solely from the section on improvement in the 2008 version. Turning to the magnitude of the change, and I should add here that this is a personal interpretation, as others may interpret the changes differently. Of the 301 requirements, I reckon that 95, that is 32%, have not changed in their intent, although the wording has changed. Then there is another 26% where the requirements have been modified, often by extending the scope of the requirement, and 25% where the wording is almost identical to that in the 2008 version. There are, on my reckoning, 52 new requirements, which is 17% of the total, and thus there is less than 20% real change in the standard. However, if one were to compare the changes on a scale of impact, the result would probably be very much different from organization to organization. I'd now like to look at some of the requirements that have been withdrawn. Following implementation of the new version, a lady was overheard outside a job centre saying, "I wonder if there are any jobs for a management representative." This might strike you as funny, but one significant requirement that has been withdrawn is that for top management to appoint a representative with certain responsibility. This breaks a tradition that goes back well before ISO 9000 standards, to the days of military procurement, when contractors were required to appoint a person independent of those responsible for production and delivery to ensure the quality of product being delivered. I will have more to say on this later. Another requirement that has been withdrawn is that for quality manual and 6 documented procedures. So imagine the scene outside a factory where an administrator, on seeing the mountain of paperwork, exclaimed, "I heard ISO was responding to climate change, but I didn't think that meant dumping the quality manual and all our procedures." So let's look at this more closely. Although the requirement for a quality manual has been withdrawn, it has been rephrased as a requirement for the organisation to maintain documented information it deems necessary for the effectiveness of the QMS. Therefore, by all means throw away your quality manual if it's not necessary, but the removal of the requirement from ISO 9001 does not remove the need for management to communicate to interested parties their policies for managing quality, to explain to interested parties how the organisation satisfies the requirements of ISO 9001, to explain to interested parties how the organisation determines and produces the products and services it provides to its customers. So whether it's in the form of a document labelled quality manual, system description, ISO 9001 exposition, or in some other form, does not negate the need for some or all this information in an effective QMS. Subsequent to the 2000 revision, it was inevitable that requirements for specific documented procedures would be withdrawn because they were inconsistent with the requirement for the organisation to determine the documentation that is necessary. Now, I've touched on this already, and although the requirement for a management representative has been withdrawn, if top management believe that retaining the role fulfills some of the requirements on responsibility and authority, the role may legitimately continue. Requiring the QMS to be documented, as well as requiring specific documents, was a belt and braces approach designed for auditors to raise non-conformities when finding activities had not been documented. The documentation necessary is now at the discretion of the organisation's management, therefore making auditors discover what is at risk by there being no supporting documentation. Removal of a requirement for updating planning outputs is indicative of an overall reduction in prescriptive requirements. Clearly, if plans were out of date, they would not be suitable, and there is a requirement for planning outputs to be suitable for the organisation's operations. It is also no longer necessary to complete design validation prior to delivery. This exclusion I find rather strange, because in the committee draft there was a clause on development transfer, but this was removed in the draft international standard. All that remains is a requirement for the design output to meet design input requirements, and the design outputs are no longer required to be suitable for verification against design inputs. It is odd that they remove the requirement for process monitoring and measurement methods to demonstrate ability of processes to achieve results. I think this has been widely interpreted as a requirement for process capability study, but in its place is a requirement that is far less onerous. The 2000 version required internal audits to determine whether the QMS conforms to the planned arrangements, with a cross-reference here to planning of product realization and to the QMS requirements established by the organisation. This had several implications. A, that the QMS requirements established by the organisation were somehow different to or excluded the planned arrangements for product realization. And B, that the QMS had to conform to the product realization plan, or C, the audit should verify whether the QMS is capable of enabling the organisation to implement the plans for product realization. The 2015 version corrects this ambiguity by removing reference to product realization or operations, because planning of product realization is a process within the QMS not outside it. Requirements for auditors not to audit their own work has been removed because it was implicit in a more general requirement to ensure audit objectivity and impartiality. There have been many changes in the terminology used in the standard. Terms that have been used since its inception, such as quality manual and management representative, have now gone, and it will undoubtedly take considerable time before they are dropped entirely from the ISO 9000 lexicon. The requirement for appointing a person with responsibility for ensuring that the quality management system conforms to the requirements of the standard first appeared in the 1987 version. However, it was dropped in the 2000 version and now reappears in the 2015 version without referring to this person as the management representative. Ensuring that the QMS conforms to ISO 9001 rather depends upon what we mean by a QMS. If top management perceives the QMS to be a set of planned arrangements, anyone competent in interpreting ISO 9001 can check those planned arrangements for conformity to ISO 9001 and be delegated approval authority for them. Also, anyone can check if they are being implemented, but if the QMS is perceived to be a system that delivers product and services, ensuring means making certain that the right things are done right by those persons whose work affects the quality of the organization's outputs. There's really only one person in the organization who can make certain that the system conforms to the requirements, and that is the CEO. An internal auditor can advise but not make certain, and therefore the role of ensuring work is undertaken in line with those planned arrangements and the desired results are being achieved rests with the people undertaking that work. The term supplier now becomes external provider. Suppliers were perceived as organizations from which goods and services were purchased, but the term external provider can include customers that provide property that is to be returned to them after provision of the required products and services. The term product has been redefined so that it now only applies to the organization's tangible outputs, and the term service is used for its intangible outputs. These terms are used in the standard to denote deliverables. A non-conforming product is therefore no longer a non-conforming output from an internal process, but a non-conforming deliverable to a customer. Product is therefore no longer deemed to be a result of a process, as was the sense in which the term was used in the 2008 version. The result of a process is now deemed to be an output, and these can be intended outputs such as a document, decision or component, but also waste and noise, or unintended outputs such as non-conformity, stress and conflict. In the 2008 version, exclusions from product realization requirements could be granted, but now all requirements are deemed applicable unless it can be demonstrated that they are outside the scope of the QMS. Preventive action is an action which is intended to prevent occurrence of nonconformities, and although the concept has been included in ISO 9001 since its inception, preventing recurrence, however insignificant or frequent, was an unrealistic and uneconomic aspiration. Organizations are too complex to prevent anything that involves uncertainty. A risk-based approach is therefore more representative of the real world. In reality, we weigh up the potential benefits and harms of exercising one choice of action over another, and often choose to do nothing when the probability of occurrence is either very low or the consequence is insignificant, even if occurrence is highly likely. In organizations using ISO 9001, it is quite common to find that they adopt the language of the standard, using terms such as nonconformity, corrective action, quality policy, which are unlikely to be used in other organizations. Using such terms is not mandated by the standard. In fact, there is no intent to impose any specific terminology on the organization that uses ISO 9001. I would now like to turn to the new requirements, but I'm only going to address a few of the more significant requirements. Perhaps the most significant change is the inclusion of a section entitled Context of the Organization, in which there is a requirement to determine the internal and external issues relevant to the organization's purpose and strategic direction that affect its ability to achieve the intended results of its QMS. There are several concepts within this statement that need some unpicking, as I'm sure you'll be aware. So let's look at some of these key terms. Issues. There is a note under this requirement explaining what such issues might be. It explains that they are any positive or negative factors or conditions, and therefore external issues could be political, economic, social, technological, legal and environmental factors, or PESTEL for short. We can reveal the external issues by asking what is going on in the external environment that could affect our future direction. And some of these will have the potential for moving the organization forward, and some will have the potential for holding it back. The internal issues could be values, culture, knowledge and performance, which are commonly referred to as strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, or SWOT for short. If we now ask what is going on in the internal environment that could affect our future direction, we will identify our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, and thereby identify another set of issues that will have the potential for moving the organization forward or for holding it back. The purpose of an organization is what it does, sometimes referred to as a mission. The strategic direction of an organization is an expression of where it is going, what it wants to become, its vision or its aspirations. For example, in 1903, when Henry Ford built his first automotive plant, he hired a corps of young able men who believed in his vision to make the Ford Motor Company into one of the world's greatest industrial enterprises. Indeed, a vision that he realized in his lifetime. The intended results of the QMS are that it consistently provides products and services that meet customer and applicable legal requirements. Certification is not a result of the QMS, but of the assessment process, although it could be argued that assurance of product and service quality is what one obtains from operating an effective QMS. Unlike previous versions, which only considered the requirements of customers, the 2015 version requires the requirements of interested parties to be determined. However, this is limited to the requirements relevant to the intended results of the QMS, so there will be those related to the organization's products and services, and not, for example, a dividend on investments. An important characteristic of a system is that it has a boundary. It is an imaginary line which envelops what the system needs to control to deliver its outputs. The boundary may therefore envelop the whole organization or be less if considering the QMS to be a subsystem, or it may extend beyond the organization if there are elements external to the organization it needs to control. In the 2008 version, top management were required to ensure that communication takes place regarding the effectiveness of the QMS. But in the 2015 version, they are now to take accountability for the effectiveness of the QMS, meaning that top management should be able to explain what the organization is doing that has brought about the success, and if necessary, to explain what the organization is doing that has brought about its failure, and what, if anything, is being done to remedy that situation and prevent its recurrence. The onus has moved from the management representative to top management. While the 2008 version included the process approach principle, there was no onus on top management to adopt that principle, but this has now been remedied. Top management are now required to promote the use of the process approach and risk-based thinking, meaning that top management must have adopted the associated principles and concepts and adapted their style of management to reflect behaviors consistent with these principles and concepts that others will follow. In the 2008 version, responsibility for processes was to be assigned to the management representative. But in the 2015 version, the responsibility for ensuring that the processes are delivering their intended outputs may be assigned to any competent person. A common solution is to appoint process owners, and they are the people who have the most to gain if the process succeeds and the most to lose if it fails. The new requirement for organizational knowledge recognizes that knowledge is a resource that is vital to success, and therefore it's important to ensure there is sufficient supply of it. However, it's also important to recognize that the possession of knowledge of itself does not bring understanding, and understanding does not necessarily bring wisdom. Therefore, knowledge alone is not the key to success. The awareness requirements of the 2008 version have been extended to embrace all persons under the organization's control, so one won't be able to put the blame on external providers when something goes wrong. One of the significant changes has been the position of the QMS in the organization, and additional requirements for integration of QMS requirements into business processes has emphasized that the QMS is not a separate system as many have hitherto believed. Let's look at this more closely. A system is a set of interrelated or interacting elements forming an integrated whole, and therefore in building an organization as a system, we link together all the interrelated or interacting elements. The standard requires we establish a quality management system, and therefore this system is also an integrated whole. But the standard also requires we integrate the QMS requirements into the organization's business processes. Unpicking the words here, we might well ask, where does the QMS fit? Does it fit here, 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 or here? Or we could ask, where do the QMS elements fit? The elements are unintegrated until we make the linkages, so we could envisage the QMS elements being found in every part of the organization, in every process, just like this, parts of every process in the organization. In the 2008 version, planning and control of changes to the QMS was confined to maintaining its integrity, whereas in the 2015 version, it has been recognized as a process that is triggered once a need for change has been identified, for example, as a result of performance evaluation, management review, or risk assessment. Unlike previous versions, which focused on customers that the organization has chosen to serve, the 2015 version applies to products and services offered to potential customers. So, for example, in a conventional process, customers place orders which are subject to review, following which there is a design, make, deliver sequence. By introducing the notion of potential customers, the sequence changes. It now includes research undertaken to establish the needs of the market, to identify unfulfilled needs and opportunities for new products and services, and thus marketing becomes within the scope of the QMS. ISO 9001 now applies to activities undertaken to attract customers as well as to satisfy them. In general, the 2008 version did not bring product and service advertising into the scope of the QMS, but that has now changed with the introduction of a requirement for the organization to ensure that it can meet the claims for the products and services it offers. This not only applies to advertising literature, but verbal claims made by sales personnel. The requirements in the 2008 version on improvement left some doubt as to whether they applied to product and service improvement, as the emphasis was on improving the QMS. This ambiguity has now been remedied with a requirement for improving products and services to meet requirements, as well as to address the future needs and expectations. I've only addressed what I consider to be the most significant of the 52 new requirements, and you may be surprised that I did not include the requirement for addressing risk among them. As I will explain in a moment, this was a modification of an existing requirement. Turning now to the modified requirements, I deduced that 78 requirements were modified. Probably the one which will give most cause for concern is the requirement for addressing risks and opportunities. I mentioned previously this is not new, but a modification of the preventive action requirements of previous versions. Having identified issues that potentially affect the ability of the QMS to achieve its intended results, that is, consistently provide conforming products and services, and identify the needs and expectations of relevant interested parties, the standard now requires these issues and requirements to be considered and risks and opportunities to be determined and addressed. Basically, this is saying that the QMS is not a static system which, once documented, remains suitable for its purpose, and it's just a question of adhering to policies and procedures. The internal and external environment is in constant flux, and for the QMS to be effective, it has to adapt and respond to actual and potential changes. The quality policy now has to be applied as well as being communicated and understood. This may appear to be an unnecessary change, but if we think about it, we can envisage a situation where personnel can recite the quality policy. They know how it affects what they do, but they continue being reactive. It has not changed their behavior. Applying the quality policy is thinking and behaving in line with the policy. The 2015 version places greater emphasis on results than did the 2008 version. It is no longer sufficient to establish policies and objectives, to implement policies and procedures, or to operate processes. The QMS has to achieve the intended results, and top management have to ensure it does so. Also, the work environment has been defined in ISO 9000 as the set of conditions under which work is performed, and the conditions stated as including physical, social, psychological and environmental factors. The 2008 version had excluded psychological factors. This anomaly has now been remedied in the 2015 version, which means that human factors are now recognized as factors that affect product and service quality. Outsourcing was introduced into the 2000 version, and outsourced processes were required to be controlled, but they were treated no differently to any other purchase service. In the 2015 version, outsourced processes remain part of the QMS. What this means is that in addition to identifying the outsourced processes in the QMS, you need to describe how you manage these processes, and this will differ from the way ordinary purchases are managed. With previous versions, actions to prevent recurrence of potential non-conformity, i.e. risk, were designed into processes as a result of implementing preventive action. However, the 2015 version goes further by requiring actions to address both risks and opportunities to be integrated into the QMS processes. This means that when designing processes or reviewing processes of existing design, you need to locate the stage where the conditions need to change to reduce an identified risk or exploit an opportunity, and then change those conditions accordingly. Turning now to the direction of change. By far the most significant change is the introduction of the harmonized structure that aligns all management system standards. In looking at other management system standards that have been revised, I've already noticed some differences in the way the technical committees have responded to Annex SL. It's just a matter of time, therefore, before Annex SL will change. There will be a consolidation of requirements where there has been duplication. For example, if we look at the design and development control, we find many references to records in the 2008 version, which they have amalgamated into one requirement in the 2015 version. The same applies to non-conformity and corrective action. Requirements for corrective action had been removed from the section on internal audit so that the general requirement applies. There will be transition from preventive action to risk-based thinking, although risk-based thinking is not an actual requirement. The only requirement is for risks to be identified and addressed at a high level and not just at product level. There is an attempt to emphasize that the QMS is integrated into the organization's business processes, moving away from the perception that a QMS can be a standalone system. Requirements of the standard extend their reach into strategic planning, marketing and advertising. Only time will tell whether the requirements are being expressed succinctly enough for this transition to be made. The standard has been made more user-friendly to the service sector, but sadly still carries indications of manufacturing bias. Finally, I'd like to share with you a model of the system which I think ISO 9001 addresses. Let us suppose we put a boundary around the organization, and outside that boundary are the interested parties. One of these are customers that have needs and expectations which it transmits to the organization into its operations subsystem, which in response supplies products and services to customers. The operations subsystem doesn't just come into being, it has to be designed and resourced, and all of that and much more is handled by a management subsystem. This subsystem has several major components, one of which is a planning subsystem, which interacts with the interested parties to set that strategic direction and establishes and directs the operations subsystem in response. Another is a resource subsystem, which gets resources from the interested parties and delivers them to the whole organization. And finally, a control subsystem, which receives feedback from the operations subsystem and from elsewhere and regulates performance. Now we ask ourselves, which is the QMS? And I put it to you that it is all those elements within these subsystems that create and retain customers. However, this is only a model and not reality, but as George Box, the British statistician, said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And the practical question is, how wrong do they have to be to not be useful? I'll leave you to ponder this question. So in summary, I've overviewed the changes between the 2008 and the 2015 version of ISO 9001. I've examined the requirements that have been withdrawn, some of the changes in terminology, some of the new requirements, the modified requirements, and given you some idea of the direction in which ISO 9001 and family of standards are changing. I've also offered a model of the organization as a system, which should give you food for thought. If you do have any questions, then please submit them to me by email at the address given here. Thank you.